Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the session on R&D. By way of introduction, my name is Soham. I'm an audit and accounts manager at Grumberg and involved in many of our R&D claims. I'm delighted to be joined today by our technical lead, Simon, who will be running the session, as well as my colleagues, Emma and Sia, who you'll hear from a bit later on. So, why are we here today? What are we hoping to achieve? Well, as many of you will know, the R&D regime has undergone substantial changes over the last 12 to 18 months, from HMRC mandating reports on all claims to introducing a brand new merge scheme earlier this year. This constant rule changing has understandably created a great deal of uncertainty about R&D as a whole, what HMRC are actually looking for, and crucially, whether a claim should be pursued. So in short, this is exactly what we'll be addressing today so that you leave with a clearer understanding of what R&D is, how to identify it within your business, and what you need to be demonstrating to HMRC. Because after all, despite all of the changes and the negative press that's been around, R&D is still a very generous tax incentive for companies. That is, of course, until Labour get their hands on it, but let's not open that door right now. As with anything tax related, just the caveat here that there are going to be some complex areas to R&D that we will be touching upon throughout today's session. So if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, which should be towards the bottom of your screen, and we'll pick them up in the Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I shall now hand you over to Simon for the main event.
Thanks so much, Soham. Nice to meet you, everybody. And apologies for any of you that were affected by my postponement last week due to a dental problem, of all things. But thanks for your patience. Yes, Soham gave a very good introduction to the session, and hopefully I can try and produce some clarity for you around what is now an ever more complex scheme. Sorry. So we'll start with an introduction to the guidelines. At the end of the day, the way HMRC work this, and I'm sorry if I'm looking to the side, I'm looking at my big screen. The way that HMRC work this is they have produced guidance for some time, and any disputes tend to get pulled back into the guidance or the guidelines, and then the arguments ensue basically between the interpretation. So part of the session today is to look at the guidelines, very top level view, and point out the key areas that HMRC tend to pick up upon. So what is the scheme? It's actually quite old now. It's established in the year 2000. Its original intention was to encourage companies to undertake innovation and development. It's based on the R&D costs that a company incurs, and depending on whether you're profit making or not, it's either a reduction to your corporation tax or perhaps a cash payment. There are some basic caveats. You must be a limited company that is already subject to corporation tax. Your R&D activities have to be qualifying, and this is where it all starts from, really. What many organizations consider to be R&D within their business wouldn't be eligible as per HMRC's definition of R&D. And you have to have performed work on eligible R&D and have evidence that you spent money in that pursuit. So let's kick off then with the definitions and guidelines. There are a lot of them. I will try and provide a helicopter view, and I will signpost HMRC documentation so that if you wish to delve in deeper, you'll be able to see where I'm coming from and where the guidance sits. So originally, the guidance was generated by a department within the government known as BIS, and it stayed as BIS from, I think, 2008 to 2016. It then got rebranded as BAYS, and that ran until 2023, and it's now being rebranded as DSIT. So you'll find a lot of cross-pollination, people calling it BIS, people calling it BAYS, people calling it DSIT. The actual guidance hasn't changed very much over that period. It's just the acronym that people use to explain it. There's a live link there to the top level guidelines that I'm about to run through. There's a further slide at the end with a bit more around that, and we can of course share this with you at the end of the session. The top level thing that we need to start from is the concept that HMRC sees R&D as occurring when a project aims to achieve an advance in science or technology by addressing a scientific or technological uncertainty. And that is really the North Star to all of this. If you cannot find a methodology to explain why your R&D project hasn't sought to achieve an advancement in science or technology and wasn't trying to address a scientific or technological uncertainty, then it will be very difficult, should HMRC inquire, to justify the submission for R&D tax credit. So, advance in science and technology. This is where the minefield really started, and I'd like to say post-COVID. I think prior to COVID, the guidance never changed, but HMRC's application of it and reference to it was not entirely consistent. And there were many projects that were submitted successfully and upon which tax credits were paid out, where in the current climate, it wouldn't pass. So the key, following on from the advance in science and technology that we talked about at in the previous slide, is it must be an overall advancement in science and technology, not just the company's own understanding. So you can see that in red. Moving forward, there'll be a number of red sections, and that really is, shall we call it, a signpost to where many claims would now trip up. So what does this mean? In very simple terms, what it means is just because it's pushing the envelope of technology for you and your organization doesn't necessarily, of course, mean that other companies are already doing it quite comfortably, and therefore you're playing catch up around the science and technology. So that wouldn't be eligible for R&D tax credits. An advance in science and technology, or technology, sorry, can be tangible or intangible. So it could be a product, but it could be a scientific methodology to improve a process. So software development to automate a process wouldn't necessarily be a tangible product, but it would be eligible. Within this section, HMRC clearly state that routine improvements using known technology without enhancing it doesn't qualify. So you do have to find a project whereby you can see that there was genuine scientific uncertainty about how you could create an improvement to the product or service that you are looking to perform R&D on. And if it's just a routine thing that many other engineers dropped in could easily accomplish, then that wouldn't be considered to be R&D. So how do they work out, or how do you justify to HMRC that an advance in science or technology is being sought? The way you do it, and the way HMRC expect you to submit your AIF, if you know about these things, or the methodology for pulling together a report, in general terms, is that you start by clearly defining the baseline and the advancement. And so the baseline is the current state of science and technology at the outset of the project, and the advancement is a narrative to explain how you're trying to make an advancement over that baseline. This leads us to one of many HMRC red flags, confusing a commercial advancement with an advance in science and technology. So poor example possibly, but let's just say I develop a new app and it's never seen before on the market, and it's to marry people who are looking to get a specific pedigree puppy with dog breeders. So you go into the app, you see what dog breeders are around, when their puppies are due, what the pedigree line is, and you start to chat with an owner, and you agree to buy a puppy. I believe, I haven't a clue, but I believe that no similar app exists. So commercially, it would be very innovative. However, if you put that to HMRC as an R&D project, their first question is, well, why is the underlying technology any different to the technology that's used by any matchmaking app, Tinder or whatever? And that probably would be a difficult argument to put over. So that's an example of confusing commercial advancement with an advancement in science and technology. Carrying on with this section, we talked about the Bayes guidelines. There's a specific paragraph, and it's called paragraph 9, and it breaks down 4 areas. You don't have to fall within one of these 4 areas, but if you do fall within one of these 4 areas, it is much easier, of course, to explain where your sought for advancement in science and technology sits. So the first section, HMRC acknowledge, they call 9A, and that's to extend the overall knowledge or capability in a field of science or technology. And that is quite highfalutin. Examples would be Pfizer with COVID drug, or some major step forward in quantum computing and AI. It's generally fair to say that at an SME or medium-sized business level, it's not often that a project falls in category 9A. 9B is where you are trying to create a process device, product or service which incorporates or represents an increase in overall knowledge or capability in a field of science or technology. Quite a mouthful. Examples there would be, again, quite highfalutin, aerospace materials, a new carbon negative material which may be used in construction. Again, not likely that many SMEs, some university spinouts may well be falling under 9B, but established SMEs looking to further their product lines, it's not really likely that 9B would be a fit. 9C is where most claims reside. Make an appreciable improvement to an existing process, material, device, product or service through scientific or technological changes. So some sort of enhancement to a traditional engine, a new methodology for reducing friction and making it more fuel efficient. Something to do with improving a water purification system, superior packaging for food preservation. So where the technology exists and is well understood, but you are seeking to appreciably improve it. Use science or technology to duplicate the effect of an existing process, material, device, product or service in a new or appreciably improved way. So a product which does the same job as another product, but it does it in a fundamentally different manner. So 3D printing in construction, a truck which runs from a hydrogen fuel cell rather than traditional fuel, diesel or petrol, a glucose monitor which is non-invasive. An example I use, which is no longer contemporary, and I'm showing my age, would be the Dyson vacuum. It's a vacuum, but the cyclone technology and the bagless technology that it launched with way back when, some 20 years ago now, didn't exist. And so Dyson Hoover would have sat in section D. We haven't moved on from advanced in science or technology yet. That just goes to show how much focus HMRC places on this as an area that needs to be clearly defined. There aren't many good news stories coming out of HMRC currently over the R&D scheme, but one of the guidances, number 10, is really quite helpful, to be honest. Even if the advance in science or technology sought by project is not achieved or fully realized, R&D still takes place. And basically, my mentor that taught me about this scheme many moons ago now did say a catchphrase: HMRC loves a failure. And it goes against the grain, really, for most companies to openly talk about things that didn't go well, things that didn't go right. But if you think about it logically, no company in their right mind would expend resources, salaries, consumables on something that they didn't think they could make work. And therefore, if there is evidence of not getting it right first time and skilled engineers taking a few attempts to resolve a problem, there could well be an underlying element of R&D, eligible R&D to that story. So a really good thing to consider when you're thinking back across your accounting period and what might or might not be R&D is to consider the things that went wrong, probably went badly wrong, and then consider the story around it and see if there's eligible R&D. The other thing, which is quite helpful, if a particular advance in science or technology has been made or attempted, but details are not readily available, for example, a trade secret, work to achieve such an advance can still be an advance. So you do need to prove that only a handful of companies are doing what you're trying to replicate. If the whole world is doing it, and you can Google it, and there's white papers out there explaining how to do it, or God forbid, there's a YouTube video giving you step-by-step guidance on how to do it, then clearly it's not a trade secret. But if you can show that only a few of your competitors are doing it, and the knowledge as to how they've developed the technology to do it isn't in the public domain, and your engineers couldn't readily deduce how they did it, then it could still be eligible activity. However, the routine analysis, copying, or adaptation of an existing product, process, service, or material will not be an advance. So just copying what somebody else is doing, using clearly off-the-shelf knowledge, shall we say, wouldn't be R&D. We now move on to uncertainty. So we've expended all that brain energy trying to work out what projects may be classed as seeking an advancement over a baseline, and we think happy days, we've done it, we've found our R&D. Not necessarily the case. We now have the second hurdle, which is that of scientific or technological uncertainty. That arises when a competent professional cannot readily deduce how to achieve the desired outcome based on available knowledge. Again, quite a mouthful. It includes system complexities and resolving practical challenges. So the uncertainty could be, we need to make this product 30% lighter, or we need to make it 30% cheaper. And we don't know how to do it from a scientific and technological standpoint. So that can be a driver for trying to seek an advancement, or having an uncertainty as to how you'll resolve that. However, uncertainties that can be readily resolved by a competent professional working in the field are not scientific or technological uncertainties. And this is the first of many references to what HMRC called a competent professional. So I'd like to discuss two things around this slide. There's another, there's some more bullets to come, but now's a good time to talk through two things. Firstly, what is a competent professional? Competent professionals have always existed in the guidance, but HMRC's focus on them and need for verification of their presence and efforts wasn't something that was heavily chased down, to be perfectly honest, until post-COVID. But now it would be very, very unwise to submit an R&D report without clearly outlining who your competent professional or professionals were or are, and what efforts they were making on the project, and how they can justify that the project is eligible. So what is a competent professional? A competent professional is someone with bona fide skills, experience, qualifications in the field of science or technology that the R&D project is being performed within. So, for example, if it was a software project, you would expect there to be at least a software developer, if not a computer scientist or someone with letters after their name around the world of computer science. If it was a mechanical engineering project, it should be a qualified or highly skilled or highly experienced mechanical engineer, and so on. So gone are the days where an estate agent would hire a company to develop a CRM system specifically for estate agencies. And then the estate agent would say, I'm the competent professional because I know all about my industry and I know what is needed for the CRM system to work properly. No, because they are not a skilled computer science engineer or even a software developer. So how can they possibly say that it's an advancement in software? So that's part A that I wanted to discuss. Part B that I wanted to discuss is readily deducible, which is on the top bullet. If you bear with me for 1 minute, I'll try and keep this analogy short. It's a little crass, but it goes like this. I'm the chairman of, let's say, Aston Martin, and I come storming into the engineering department on a Monday morning, and I shout at the team, I need a 25% lighter gearbox for the next model. And a few things might happen, but let's play along with this and think that perhaps everyone stares at the feet, and then someone plucks up the courage to say to me, but we've already made it as light as we can, and we're already worried it won't handle the torque of the new engine that we're developing, and we're already very, very worried that it won't last 50,000 miles if driven hard. I don't care. I want one 25% lighter. Well, if you can give us 6 months and £500,000, we make no promises, but we'll see what we can do. On the flip side, what might happen is I say the same thing, and Fred in the corner says, all right, Gov, leave it with me. And I walk into my nice chairman's office 2 days later, and there's a shiny new gearbox sitting on my desk. And that's really my analogy for readily deducible. At the one end of the spectrum, a team of experienced, competent professionals really can't be sure they're going to achieve the objectives of the project. On the other end of the spectrum, they haven't been asked to do it before, but once asked to do it, they kind of could readily deduce how they were going to go about it and weren't really fazed by it. So that's the second big hurdle, that of having a competent professional and having that competent professional not be able to readily deduce how to achieve the desired outcome. Again, routine adjustments or optimizations without significant scientific challenge do not qualify. So what we need at this section of the report is clearly defined uncertainties. So it can't be, we weren't sure how we could do it. It should be, we weren't sure how we could reduce 30% of material and maintain the strength that was required, something along those lines. So moving on with the guidance, paragraph 20 talks about overall knowledge or capability. And this is the yardstick. So this readily deducible by a competent professional. If pushed, you don't need to have this in your initial report, but if it goes to inquiry and if you're pushed on the subject, what you need to be able to say, or your competent professional certainly needs to be able to say, is that what was available in the public domain would not be enough for me to readily deduce how to solve this objective or how to achieve this objective. Carrying on, 21-22. This is a continuation of the previous slide, really, which talked about trade secrets. So overall knowledge or capability can still be sought to be advanced where several companies are on the cutting edge and doing similar work independently. So that could be Branson's hyperplane versus Elon Musk's hyperplane, for example. Work has already been done, but this is not known in general because it's a trade secret, as already mentioned. It's known that a particular advance in science or technology has been achieved, but the details of it are not readily available. So again, that could be ChatGPT's work on AI. There are some very secretive elements in there, I'm sure, that can't be reverse engineered just by somebody having a working knowledge of the core concepts of AI. And again, however, the routine analysis, copying or adaptation of an existing process, material, device, product or service will not advance overall knowledge or capability, even though it may be completely new to the company or the company's trade. So playing catch up to something which is prevalent in your sector and your competitors are already doing, that may be R&D for you to get to play the catch up and to get to the same level, but it wouldn't be considered to be R&D from HMRC's perspective. If you remember, when we go back to um, paragraph 9, and I talked about A, B, C, and D, I said most of the R&D work that we tend to submit for SMEs and smaller mid-sized businesses is around 9C, appreciable improvement. That's entered into in a bit more detail in paragraph 23. So it's got to be more than a minor or routine upgrade. So this appreciable improvement has to appreciably improve the level of science or technology in that sector, or the characteristics that we're talking about. And it should be the case that another competent professional, if they got to look over it, would say, yeah, hats off, that's a genuine and non-trivial thing. And similarly, if you see an area like the cyclone, the Dyson cyclone, cyclones have existed in Mother Nature from the year dot, but cyclone technology to accelerate air has been around for some time. But no one prior to Dyson had thought to use it to create a vacuum. And I think it's fair to say the number of patents that he had to fight showed that the other competent professionals really had to tip their hat to him and say, no, we hadn't thought of that, and no, we wouldn't readily deduce how to make it work. So they would have supported him in his statement that that's an appreciable improvement using technology from another field of science. Carrying on with appreciable improvement, we move on to guidance 2425, big red one here. Improvements which arise from taking existing science or technology and deploying it in a new context, for example, a different trade with only minor or routine changes, are not appreciable improvements. Difficult for me to think of an easy analogy there. I suppose something like if well, this is a very, very crass example, but if there's a special adhesive, waterproof adhesive, which is used for the manufacture of fish tanks, and the local plumber works out that that's really, really good for making temporary repairs to household plumbing. So it's taken a product not designed for his trade, but he's put it into use very effectively in his trade. That's quite novel and innovative, but there's no R&D around that. And again, we see the word competent for professional. At the end of the day, HMRC is relying on us to put forward competent professionals who effectively can put their hand on their heart and say this was not trivial. This is definitely, I would like to think that if one of my peers was helicoptered in and presented with the same problem, they would equally struggle. We now move on to the third hurdle, which is uncertainty or system uncertainty. This results from the complexity of system uncertainty, specifically results from the complexity of a system rather than uncertainty about how its individual components behave. So HMRC actually give an example, and it's in their guidance. But for example, you make a DVD player and there's a component obsolescence. The power supply is no longer available and you have to work in a different design of power supply. That power supply may well be off the shelf, but putting it on your board with the requirements of all the other devices on your board creates an issue that you couldn't have foreseen and you couldn't readily resolve. That would be called a system complexity or system uncertainty. And if you needed to perform R&D to make it work, then that would be eligible. And so the other example they give would be software. No one, very few people are writing a completely new line of code that's never been written before. And most people are assembling snippets or pieces of code and building blocks, creating an architecture to create a platform, say, that performs a certain function. Well, if it's just routine gluing together that any software engineer or software developer could do without really breaking into a sweat, that's not R&D. However, if they put it together and it doesn't work, and really there's no one else out there that would know how to make it work either, and they have to create new algorithms to create the process flow that they need, then that would be considered to be R&D if evidenced. So again, if you're just bolting together standard technologies, you need to identify the fact that there is a scientific or technological uncertainty. So the competent professional, even though all of those standard technologies existed, the competent professional couldn't determine how they could be put together to work as a system. Okay, so now we'll just touch on the activities that HMRC. So you've gone through all this. You've found your baseline. You've explained it. You've explained how you've tried to make an advancement. You've made it absolutely clear that you've got some uncertainties and that your highly skilled and experienced team didn't instinctively know how to resolve it and therefore had to perform R&D or eligible R&D to resolve it. So you've done all that. You now need to consider what activities are accepted and what activities aren't accepted, because this is another red flag that HMRC are very hot on. So guidance or guideline 27, activities to create or adapt software, materials or equipment needed to resolve the scientific or technological uncertainty, provided that the software, material or equipment is created or adapted solely for use in R&D. That's a real mouthful, but what it means is if you need to write a piece of software to have a piece of test equipment perform the tests you need to verify your R&D, then the time you spent writing that software would qualify. Similarly, if you need to write some software to operate a machine and the machine itself is a form of appreciable improvement, it's a new design of engine, it's a new design of manufacturing equipment using new technology, then the efforts to have a minimum viable piece of software to operate it and test it would be compliant. Your planning activities. So once you've identified that you're going to need to perform R&D, all the time spent on planning would be a contributing activity. And then if you do anything around scientific rigor, scientific research, so scientific or technological design, testing and analysis, as they say, to resolve it, then that would be eligible. There are some indirect activities that are eligible too. These are activities which form part of a project but don't directly contribute. So if you need to do some scientific and technical information gathering, so information gathering and report writing, then that would be eligible. Your clerical duties around the staff who are performing the R&D, an element of their time, if it's payroll, can be considered, and as well finance and personnel, HR. Anything in terms of needing to hire additional staff, needing to lease laboratory space, and owning and operating R&D equipment, that those activities, if they're essential to the task of R&D, they can be considered. Any training, so if you need to get in a special piece of test equipment to train staff to test to make sure that the R&D is going the way it needs to go, then that training cost can be considered. If you engage with students or researchers at universities, anything where you need to do research, including the data collection to devise a new method of testing or survey or sampling, if that's not an R&D project in its own right, but is needed to support your R&D project, that can be eligible. Oh, I do apologize. Bit of hysteresis there. And feasibility studies. So once you understand that R&D is needed, and you need to go away and think about it rather than just dive straight in and try anything, that time and effort can be considered to be eligible activity. However, there are some, in fact, very many people that submit time, money, and therefore make a financial submission, which would be ineligible. So any sort of routine work, so any sort of routine machine maintenance, anything to do with once you've developed the product, taking it to market, that's not R&D. That's a commercial thing that all companies have to do, and HMRC won't pay you for. So there's a big red flag. There's a red flag over ineligible projects, but equally there's red flags around ineligible expenditure. Gone are the days of wet finger in the air. Oh, let's take 50% of that. Let's take 75% of that. Yeah, that sounds about right. If it goes to inquiry and it's clear that you've overstated the amount of expenditure, of course, that doesn't look very good. And similarly, as I say, sort of wet finger in the air, a poor estimation method to capture the expenditure. If it goes to inquiry and your defense is, well, 50% sounded about right, of course, isn't going to stand up very well either. The next one we're going to discuss is project boundaries. I appreciate I'm going at quite a lick here. There's a lot to get through in a relatively short space of time, so I do apologise. Project boundaries, again, gone are the days of saying, well, we spent a year on that, so let's claim for everyone for the whole year. HMRC's definition is that the project work starts when you understand that you've got a problem that you need to resolve, and it finishes when you know it's resolved or you've given up, basically. So it's not the entire, we're designing a new DVD player, so the whole thing's R&D. It would be when you work out that that power supply isn't working, and the work around getting that power supply to work or getting the board to work with the power supply. That would be your R&D. So further work after resolving the uncertainty. So the DVD player board now works, but you need to make the case a little bit bigger to fit it, or things like that, or putting the new board into production. That's standard commercial stuff. What can happen though, of course, is you solve your problem and you think you've cracked it, and then it moves further on into production, and then you find that you haven't actually cracked it, and after 3,000 hours it packs up, and the R&D may start again. But again, you do a claim for the spike of work around the original problem and a claim for the spike of work around the newfound problem, not the entire time frame in between. So the expectation here is that you clearly identify your project boundaries, and that means to say, typically I would suggest month and year start, month and year end. Planning. We're now up to guidance 36, 37. I think it runs to the mid 40s, so we're getting there for those that are beginning to lose the will to live. Qualifying R&D planning. So activities that directly contribute to resolving the uncertainty, such as defining your objectives, doing that feasibility that we talked about, any sort of outlining technical work, that would qualify. Non-qualifying, we've already talked about things like market research, things about sorting out your financial, legal around the bigger picture, the commercial picture. That wouldn't be linked to resolving the uncertainty. That wouldn't qualify. One of the chinks in the armor with HMRC is abortive projects. Please, if you think back to my earlier statement, HMRC loves a failure. Paragraph 38, not all projects succeed. What counts is whether there was an intention to achieve an advance in science or technology, not whether it was successfully or completely resolved, or even resolved to a degree. So think back, what did you abort? And was it because you just couldn't achieve the aims you sought? In which case, does that mean, looking at the other criteria, you may have been undertaking R&D? This is I haven't put it down as a red flag, but it can be considered a bit of a red flag, and it's paragraph 42. Doing R&D to, if I give you a really simple example, I don't know, making a part out of making a part using a different finish painting it with one type of paint, but then deciding you want to use a more robust type of paint which lasts longer. That would be considered a cosmetic or aesthetic thing, and there's no R&D around it. However, if you need to design an all new type of paint or a blend of paint which isn't out there and readily available off the shelf, to achieve the balance between thickness, um, uh, uh, immutability, its ruggedness, not to crack, for use at very high temperatures, and so on and so forth, then there's actually R&D to create a cosmetic improvement. So it's a very difficult one to explain, but the rough guide is, if you're just trying to make a cosmetic improvement and there's nothing underlying to the technology or science behind it, then that wouldn't be R&D. Right, so competent professional. We'll do a whole slide on it. You need to clearly identify them. And as I say, gone are the days of self-certification by C-level execs saying, I've been in the industry a long time, I know which way's up. That can work if you can prove that you've been at the coalface at that time. But more likely than not, HMRC would say, no, we need to talk to the engineers. So they need to have relevant expertise. They have a deep knowledge of the scientific or technological principles involved, and be aware of what the current temperature is in the outside world around that technology. They should ideally have experience and qualifications, even better if they've been published. And in their judgment, they are able to say that there was genuine scientific or technological uncertainty. Okay, I've gone through an awful lot there, and I do appreciate that's an awful lot to take in, and it does feel quite daunting first time around. And they've always existed. Everything I ran through there has existed almost from day one. There have been a number of small changes, but the core content hasn't changed for something like 24 years. It's the way HMRC is interpreting it and using it in the current climate that's changed dramatically since COVID. And what HMRC did in October of 23, so just over a year ago, they issued or launched something called Guidance for Conformance version 3, or GFC 3, where they tried to distill all of that into some key points, so that the people who wanted to find out more about it and get a quick helicopter view, invest a little bit of time without having to trawl through the whole thing, would get a good sense of which way's up. So the next few slides run through the key points from this Guidance for Conformance 3. So again, key point, a competent professional is needed to identify projects. It must relate to a recognized area of science or technology. So social sciences are out, for example. You couldn't do one on education or psychology or something like that. You need to have clearly identified uncertainties, not just general, oh, we're not sure we can make it work. Clear objectives where you weren't sure how you could achieve them. You have to make it clear the competent professional, again, is heavily involved here to justify why the uncertainty can't be resolved using readily available knowledge. So a quick Google or reading of a white paper isn't going to get you there. You need to be able to create the baseline. So state the existing level of knowledge. And that is not today, because the world moves very quickly. That's at the point where the R&D was undertaken. We've talked about boundaries. We need to be clear as to when the uncertainty was first identified. We need to be clear about when the point was that it was resolved or not. You need to talk about the activities you performed to try and resolve the uncertainties. So there needs to be a nice narrative which said, we first tried this, the result was, let's say, 70% successful. These elements were fixed, but these elements remained a problem. So therefore, we went back to the drawing board and we tried something else and we got to 80%, or we went backwards, we went back to 60%. So we tried again. So ideally, a nice chronological narrative which talks about a number of steps trying to resolve the uncertainty, or uncertainties plural. Again, thinking about it logically, if your narrative is we gave it to Bert, he ran a program, he decided he was going to change the material used from this version to that version, and it worked to charm, HMRC would say that doesn't sound like it wasn't readily deducible by a competent professional. It sounds like Bert knew in his gut what he was going to do, and he pretty much got it right first time. So there probably wasn't R&D taking place there. So again, it's really helpful to have a narrative which clearly shows the missteps, clearly shows that there wasn't a leap between an idea and a resolution that was bounded in a single leap. That a plan for resolving the uncertainties. Again, anything that can be done to show that it was a concerted, planned effort rather than just bouncing from mishap to mishap in a haphazard manner would be helpful. Anything that shows that a team of competent professionals were trying to perform their work diligently and to a plan. So we've talked about the steps. Again, something more than one step is expected. Second slide on this. We need to identify clearly the activities which are considered to be direct contributions. And then, of course, we can add, not narrative, but when we get to looking at the financials, we can include indirect qualifying activities. It's really important. The new guidance is quite clear that qualifying costs need to be accurately tracked and claimed. Okay, thank you so much for bearing with me on that. I see we've got a few minutes left. We're nearly at the end. There are some helpful materials, and we can share these with you after the session. Grunberg has a Word document that I call a discussion template. So at the point when you're considering R&D projects, this is a really helpful document to run through the key information and therefore have a sanity check as to whether it probably or probably won't stack up in terms of HMRC guidance. So we need clear start and end dates, we've discussed. We need to identify the area of advance, as discussed. We need to have a clear baseline and how you're trying to make an improvement to that baseline. We need to cover the uncertainties that the project had and the activities that were undertaken to try and address those uncertainties. We need details on the competent professionals. It's a strange one. HMRC don't actually need that as part of the initial submission, but if it goes to inquiry, it's the first thing they ask. So it's worth capturing that and having that in your report, even if it doesn't get uploaded to HMRC in the initial upload. The guidance I would suggest is that you fill one of these in per project that you're considering. So for those that wish to delve deeper, the actual scheme sits under CIRD or CURD 8000. The DSIT guidelines that I've run through, those paragraphs, sit under 81910. And the guidance for conformance is a separate web portal, and there's a link there. So I would start with the guidance for the conformance. It's quite a nice summary of what I've discussed. I'd then move on to the CURD DSIT guidance, which is the first slides that I ran through. And then CURD 8000, you really are getting into the world of HMRC and tax. And that's when you can't really get clarity on what you're looking for in these first two documents. I would like to think that 90% plus of the obvious questions you may ask yourself about the scheme are covered in these two documents. That's it from me. Thanks so much for your time. I'll now pass over to Soham and Sia.
Thank you so much, Simon, for the brilliant presentation. It was so thorough and informative. I'm pretty sure HMRC themselves would have taken notes. So, looking ahead, we have an exciting follow-up session planned, which will focus on R&D expenditure and the key changes in this area. The session will be announced in due course, so do keep an eye out for this. And then to give you a quick preview of what we'll be covering, we'll be looking at the allowable and disallowable expenditure, where we will be discussing the key changes in the rules, including new changes around overseas subcontractor costs, and how this is, for the most part, no longer eligible for relief. We'll also consider the R&D schemes and thresholds, where we'll go into more detail on the new merge scheme introduced by HMRC, and we will also be discussing the rate changes in the SME and RDEC schemes. And then finally, we'll have a look at the R&D intensity ratio, which dictates whether claims qualify under the more generous SME scheme. So as you can see, there's a lot to explore. The key takeaway for now, though, is to make sure that you're keeping detailed records of all costs incurred and that you're able to justify any R&D percentages that you're applying. So it is something that will make your life a lot easier down the line. So with that, let's move on to the Q&A part of the session. Please feel free to share any questions that you may have.
Right, thanks, Sia. Thanks, Simon, as well. I think one of the first questions we've had actually links directly to what Sia has just mentioned there. So what information should I be retaining for R&D claims? So as Sia and Simon have both alluded to, it's making sure that you are retaining all sorts of records throughout the year, whether it's costs or whether it's the actual narrative of what you've done. So that could be if you're having regular meetings with the engineering team, documenting that, retaining that, whether it's quarterly board meetings as an update, retaining all of this documentation as you go so that it doesn't become a once a year exercise where you're retrospectively having to go back and look over what's actually happened to put together the initial information that we need for preparing the R&D report. Simon, I don't know if there's anything you want to add specifically on that point in terms of record keeping.
So that was a good overview. Thank you. The only thing I'd say is if you're a software house and you run some sort of Jira for sprints, anything you can do to flag files or records for easy review moving forwards, that would be quite helpful. But yeah, as Simon says, if it's some sort of more tangible hardware-based R&D, there are regular meetings which usually take place, and some add 10 minutes to the end of every meeting just to capture everything around what might be happening that's eligible R&D.
Yeah, and I think if you'd like to reach out to Grunberg & Co, your account manager, the partner, and provide maybe quarterly or half-yearly updates so that even we are aware what's going on through the year and can advise you, then by all means do reach out to us. We're only an email or telephone call away. Okay, so we've got a few more coming in. So the next one was, were you surprised that the new Labour government did not make any changes? And do you think that they'll make any going forwards, especially now, given that claims are meticulously scrutinised, meaning the right claimant should be getting the relief as intended? So yeah, quite a few questions in this one, but absolutely, I think we were all surprised that there were no changes announced to R&D. Looking back, I think, with the merge scheme obviously being released earlier this year, there's maybe why there were no changes in the recent budget, but I am expecting that there will probably be a further change next year because after all, Labour kept on announcing that the books need to be balanced, they need to be able to fund growth, etc. within the UK. So I would absolutely be expecting more changes coming. Whether they're going to be as significant as we've seen this year with the merge scheme, I don't know, but I think there's definitely going to be something on the horizon. Next one was, please can we have more detail about qualifying indirect activities, e.g. accounts, HR, legal support, what is or isn't allowed? Some examples or guidance, please. So I think one of the points here was, do you need to apportion payroll costs, HR administrators' time for the number of people in the business versus those working on R&D? So, Simon, obviously you can expand on this, but from our perspective, yes, we need to be able to justify to HMRC how you've calculated that apportionment between different members of the team, especially those on the outside, so those on the administrative, legal, finance side. and actually have that proof to justify why those R&D percentages are being used and why they're being included in the claim in the first place.
Yeah, indeed. I wouldn't, each company operates its own processes, so it's difficult to give a general response. One approach, which I think is fair and reasonable, is you basically calculate people hours on R&D, and then you calculate overall people hours for the whole business, and you come up with a percentage, and then you can apply that percentage to all of the peripheral staff. So if your R&D represents 10%, it's not going to be a high figure, is it? 10% of your overall company expenditure, then putting 10% of your peripheral staff salaries as qualifying indirect activity would be a fair and reasonable estimate. If you have other systems in place and you're able to be more granular, the more granular you are, obviously, the less arguments HMRC are likely to have with you. But as a starting point in terms of common sense approach, that's what many people do.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Okay, so there are a few more questions that were coming through. So the next one was, how do we go about actually proving the baseline technology and advance being sought? So I think, from certain inquiries I've seen over the last few years, HMRC do actually delve into, what market research have you done as a claimant into what was actually out there. Often HMRC I've found do quote, maybe unnecessary or irrelevant examples, but there's certainly an expectation on the claimant that they should have undertaken that basic level of research to say this is what's out there, this is what's actually in existence at the moment, and therefore this is why my claim is genuine and there's genuine R&D that's been undertaken and appreciable improvements. Next one was, how technical do I need to be when providing information to HMRC? So Simon, I mean, look, what kind of levels have you seen over the years with R&D reports, and in particular now with the increased scrutiny?
Yes, I alluded to the estate agent CRM system during the session, and that's a good example of what the industry was getting away with before COVID. People were putting in R&D claims for a new website development. That's how loose and lackadaisical the whole thing was. Now, frankly, if you don't have a qualified, competent professional as part of the team, and that qualified, competent professional can't put their hand up and say, yeah, I'd like to think any of my peers would have struggled. That's a really good yardstick for saying, okay, we have some certainty that this is an eligible project. So that would be my starting point, to be honest, and having a conversation with those persons, and then using the discussion template that I shared with you a few slides back, and seeing on a scale of 1 to 10, are you 7 or above? Or if you're 5 to 7, is there more that can be done? If you go back and look back on your work, talk to perhaps your subcontractors, can you fill in some gaps? But if you're below 5, then there is a risk, clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last question we've got through that we can see at the moment are costs associated with self-employed engineers. Are they allowed? So this is a really good question, and one of the key talking points of the next session that we're going to do, which is obviously, as Sia said, specifically going to cover expenditure. So as a subcontractor, the rules are currently quite grey at the moment. But they've obviously, one of the key changes is overseas subcontractors. So I think it would very much depend on where the subcontractor or the engineer in this case is actually based, and are they connected to the company? There are rules around connected, unconnected subcontractors in terms of what can be claimed and the amount that can be claimed. So I'd say, if you've got specific questions in terms of actual costs, like your self-employed staff, then do reach out to the relevant account manager at Grunberg or partner. Send us the data, send us some examples of the costs and the invoices. We can have a look and come back to you. Okay, I think that's everything that we've got for the time being. Like I said, if you guys have got any questions following today's session, then do reach out to us. As I said, we're only an email, telephone call away, We're happy to help you. We don't see this as a once a year exercise. It's good to be engaged during the process, during the year, so that all relevant information is captured in advance, so that we can make sure that your R&D claims are as robust as possible. So I'd like to obviously thank Simon, Sia, and Emma as well for their help today. And yeah, have a good day, everyone. Take care.